Hello, welcome back to my series on the lamps are going out. Here we're going to cover some of the naval and unique combat scenarios that's going on mostly in East Africa and in the Near East and some of the little wrinkles that go on there. First off, we want to talk about naval combat, and really naval combat only is limited to the blockade up here between the British and the German fleet. In the game, it starts with 3 British fleets in the blockade, and the Germans can immediately try to move in and take over if they would like. And then this will trigger a naval combat during the naval phase if there are fleets of both sides in the blockade blocks. And essentially what happens is that each side is going to roll a die for each fresh ship that there is. So in this case, there's going to be 2 dice that are rolled for the Germans and then 3 dice for the British. And then we're going to see what happens. So we're just going to roll all these together and we'll see the results. So in this situation, honestly, and interestingly enough, nothing would happen. You're looking for 1s and 2s in naval combat. So 1s would be a single hit and 2s would be 2 hits that are inflicted. In this case, neither side would hit. So what would happen is you look at who has the most fresh units. So in this case, the British have the most fresh units. That would mean that the Germans would then have to retreat, although they took no losses. If it was something like this, it was 2-2. You would say who had control of the blocks, the blockade box before the attack. In this case, again, the British would win, and so the Germans would have to retreat. If it was something like this, however, because there were no hits, they're all fresh. The Germans have more fresh units than the British. The British would then have to retreat, and the Germans would then have broken the blockade and kind of keeping the Brits pushed back. This is very important. The blockade, essentially, when we get to the production phase, which we'll talk about in a little while, it denies Great Britain 1 production point, and it gives 1 extra production point to Germany. So Germany has a real reason that they want to have that happen, and they want to be in control of the blockade. So how does the combat work if you do score hits? Let's see if we can get some 1s and 2s in here. So here we have a 1 that's rolled by the British. Essentially, the German would have to pick one of these to take a hit. And again, you see who has the most fresh fleets. Obviously, the British do. The Germans then have to retreat and go home. And that fleet's going to stay spent. It's going to be something the German player can spend production points on if they would like later. But essentially, their navy took a hit from the Brits. So again, combat's pretty easy. Each fleet rolls a die. If it was a 2, however, to say in that situation, we go back out here, the Brits rolled this 2, that's 2 hits. So the Germans would have to take 2 hits. If they had rolled something like 2 2s, that's 4 hits. 1, 2, 3 would eliminate, 4 would eliminate. Basically, the entire German fleet would have been sunk if that happens. So again, very straightforward on naval combat, and really it's a lot about denying the production points. So in a lot of ways, I kind of look at the naval combat as really an extension of the production phase. It just happens during the combat, but really is just about uh, the production. During the production phase, however, there is the U-boats that happen. So again, this is really only applies in the turns for the Western Allies and for the Germans. And it's a little bit of a flip-flop. So how, I'm going to say both of these are fresh. How this works is essentially on the German player's turn, they're going to decide what the rules of engagement are. Are they going to follow the Hague Convention, or are they going to go to unrestricted submarine warfare? and they have some choices to make there. And then they roll on an attrition table to see uh, if any of their U-boats were sunk. And then the Western Allies are going to roll based on where the Germans have their particular which side they've picked, and then they're going to see what happened. And again, what each success is going to be a loss of one Great Britain production point. So it could be really big if the Germans take the blockade and then they're able to get both U-boats take out some of the shipping there. That's 3 production points out of a total of 7 that they could deny Great Britain. So that's huge. They could basically take out almost half of the British capacity for production just by using a combination of the naval and U-boat technologies. So how does this work? Essentially, you follow the table right here in the middle. So for the Germans, say they're out here, they're going to roll 2d6 for each fresh U-boat. So they're going to do the first one, and that is a 6. It's spent. And then they're going to roll again, and that's a 5, and that is spent. So again, not great. Basically, those 2 German U-boats were discovered and were not able to do anything there. So, so if you have both U-boats spent, essentially the triple entente player doesn't have to worry about attacks. They only have to roll for each fresh U-boat. Essentially, there's no U-boats out operating. They were both taken out on the German player's turn, so there's nothing happening. But say we were in a situation where they were both fresh, the German player was able to keep both of those fresh. Um, what they're going to do is then on the player's turn, the triple entente player, they're going to roll now and see what happens with each of those. So they might roll, and here they get an 11. And so that's an unsuccessful attack by the Germans. And they're going to roll again, and they roll an 8. And so this is a success if it's an unrestricted warfare, and it's going to increase the U.S. entry marker. So that's going to irritate the U.S. player. And so if I put this out here and we kind of look at that table, there are a couple options in here that are only successes if it's in the unrestricted warfare box. So again, German player has a choice to make. There's going to be a better chance of them denying production points to Great Britain if they go unrestricted. However, there's also a greater chance that the success is going to bring the U.S. closer to coming into the war. So, a choice to make for Great Britain on how they want to deal with that, but definitely something that's out there. There's also um, on both charts, there are options that depend on what U technology are in. So, um, if Germany has U1 or U2, they might have more chances of success. And there's more spent values if the U.S. has declared war, or if the Western Allies have the U1 or U2 technology, which is essentially the U technologies are all about U-boats. So from the German side, it's about increasing the U-boats, making them more effective. They're going to get more ability to cause sinks on the triple entente player side and deny those. The triple entente player, their technology is going to make it easier to detect and eliminate those U-boats. So when the German player is rolling to see if they made it through any detection areas, there's going to be a larger chance that they're going to get detected, sunk, and that the British player won't have to worry about losing production points, and Great Britain's going to have to, or Great Britain and Germany is going to have to spend extra production to bring those U-boats back into play, because that's part of the production phase, is that they might have to spend money to flip those back over. So that is really the two naval scenarios and how they kind of dovetail into production. Again, they're very, very important to both sides in terms of either denial or gain of production values. And so definitely something that both players want to pay attention to. I want to talk real quick about one other unique combat here in East Africa. For the most part, this works standard combat like it does anywhere else. Each side is going to roll a maximum of one die and and can attack. You have to again uh, hit a attack a spent army to push it out, and either side, that's what we're trying to do, because again, victory conditions here depend on if there's one German army, they get 1 point. If there's one British army, they get 1 point. And that's the only thing that happens here in East Africa is in the end game. The difference here is that Leto Vorbak, who was the German general in the area, can actually conduct guerrilla warfare. And this is something he can do, and it will keep him fresh. So when he attacks and he declares he's doing a guerrilla combat, he just rolls his die, and on a five, or if he's fresh on a 5 or 6, he's successful. So a 2 would not be, and he would be spent. Now, the interesting thing, it's the only army in the game that can attack spent. He says he's launching a guerrilla attack again, and so he's going to roll, and he's unsuccessful. If it's a 6 when he's spent, it would be a successful guerrilla attack. So he'd be able to then attack even spent, which is important. Great Britain cannot do that, so they would not be able to attack back. They would have to spend a production point to then refit their army, uh, and they would not be able to attack, right? So it's a way that the German player can continue to gain ground. Um, but again, very hard to hit. If it's fresh, you're only hitting on 5s and 6s, and otherwise you can conduct a normal combat through conventional means as a German, just knowing that again you're going to go with high die wins, um, and attacks again would go here, but then that would spin, and since he already attacked, there's nothing else could happen. So definitely something to think about um, in terms of stuff. Now, British can refit their army. Leto Vorbak has an event is the only way that he can come back to fresh. So once he is spent, the only thing he's going to be able to do is guerrilla attacks for the whole rest of the campaign. But again, how much you want to do for the German player, since there's no production spend over here, there's really no reason that they wouldn't want to at least try a guerrilla attack each time, each turn, to see what they can do. Um, but again, little distraction, a little mini game of sorts that's worth a point. And that's the East Africa combat. So again, very simple and very tight, but could be important knowing that the Central Powers needs that 7 point threshold to win. It could be very critical for them to get that 1 point here. It might be the thing keeping them between victory and defeat. Last thing, special combat I want to talk about is the Near East. Um, Really, the only change here is that these are square boxes. You can only have one army at a time in these boxes, and um, other than that, they can only have one particular trench marker as well. So some of the limitations there. Other than that, they work pretty similarly. If the British want to advance into Jerusalem, they would have to attack. And they'd have to be successful, and that would flip. For example, this marker, if they attacked, they're going to be flipped as well. They do have, the British have production points here, so they are able to use those production points to then refit their armies and have them ready to go. So again, uh, if the Turkish player was not able to refit this army, the next attack that was rolled, and say the British were successful, which again, same thing. So say British rolls 5. Oops, we'll let them use their die. And say British rolls a 6 and the Turkish player rolls a 5. The Turkish player would then have to retreat and the British player would advance. So the square areas work just like the other areas on the map, with just the limitations that only one army at a time can be in there and only one trench marker can be in there. Other than that, they are very similar in terms of their spaces. But they're the other kind of unique area here in this Near East. This is a little more conventional than East Africa. There's not any direct points. Obviously, if the Turkish player is able to take Sinai or Basra, that denies the ability for the British player to get those production points, because those are production points there. But other than that, there's not really much else that can be said. So that's some of the other special combat cases in terms of East Africa, West naval evacuations, and talking through both the U-boats and how they work and the blockades in the naval combat. So let's now take a turn and look at the production. Okay, continuing in on production, let's talk through how that works a little bit. We already talked about the blockades and how that can affect, but what else happens with that? So after blockades, if you're Western Ally or German, you're going to check and see what happens and adjust your production values from there. You might have an event that might do something during the production phase. Um, you resolve the U-boat attacks, and then you're going to go through and see what happens in terms of production spending. So what you can spend units on is very nice. Again, if you go to the player aid, production value costs are listed at the bottom here, but we can roll through those real quick. So to refit a unit or a fleet, to refit costs 1 production point. So again, if you've got this guy in Posen here, let me fix. If I spend 1 production point, Germany starts, let's say they start with 12, that would be one of those 12. So we just flip them. For each one that you're flipping, you're spending 1 point. Pretty easy. To raise a unit, that's taking 1 out of the force pool, so off map, in each force pool box. Again, I don't have those on the screen, but typically you just place your armies in the boxes corresponding for them. Each army has a limited number. You can only purchase the numbers that you have. But say Germany wanted to build a new unit, it would be 1 to build it. And then in spent status, it would be 2 if they wanted to spend it and build it as in fresh status and ready to go. So that's basically how that works. What you do is placed in one of the nation's home areas, so they can be built in any of their home areas. And again, they just spend either 1 to put it in spent status or 2 to put it in on and fresh status. Fleets are a little more expensive, so it's 1 to kind of to flip them back, to refit them. However, if both were eliminated, it would cost 2 production points to bring it back in spent status and 3 to bring it back in full status. So fleets are just rebuilt in their home boxes, so either the German High Sea Fleet box or the British Home Fleet box, and that's how fleets are spent. Other things you can do on production is building trenches. So trenches have some limitations. They cannot be built until the spring of 1915. This is actually indicated on the turn track marker. It's got a little trench icon on it. So first 2 turns, you're not going to be building any trenches. And then when they are built, they have a few limitations. So all nations except Germany, they cost two to build. Germany, it only costs one. So for one, they can build a trench. Um, they also need to only build one trench at a time, except the Germans can deploy two built if they want. So they can spend two and drop two trenches. So Germans were a lot better at spending those trench markers. So they basically can spend two and drop two trench markers as opposed to all the other countries that have to spend two and can only build one at a time. So that's trenches. Again, relatively simple. Um, is is another thing you can spend on. And then the last thing that can be spent on is transferring of production points. And this is very important for the minor powers because they usually do not have very much, right? Rome or Italy only has one production point, for example. So, they have four armies. They're not going to be able to do much with one production point. So they are going to rely on other nations to be able to transfer them. Now, the issue there is that they can't receive more than they normally produce. So Italy has one, they can receive one, but that's it. For countries like Serbia, Serbia has zero production. The minimum is always one. So they'll still be able to receive potentially one production point. How does transferring work? Essentially, the country transferring has to be able to draw a path through their home areas to the home area of the country they're trying to supply. So Austria-Hungary, if they're getting supply from Germany, they say, yep, they're touching, they can transfer. And so Austria-Hungary has three production points. Germany can transfer up to four total, so they could transfer a max of three to Austria-Hungary. We just have some markers out here that we can place, and so to show that there's three production points that Germany gave them. Um, to transfer to Turkey, they'd have to be able to draw a path to Turkey, which right now they don't have, so they wouldn't be able to send any there. On Austria-Hungary's turn, one of the things after they would look at any events that affect production, they would receive that. And so they would add that to their three. So that would give them 6 production points for this round. So transferring production, very, very big, very important for uh, major powers to be able to do for the minor powers. So some of the things that can be done, you can transfer through one independent nation if you need to be able to supply. So, for example, down here in Serbia, at the beginning of the war, Greece is neutral. So the British could send one here, but because they're going through Greece, supplied through the port, they'd have to spend an additional one to get it here. So for 2 production points, they would be able to send one to Serbia if they would like. So that's another limitation on transferring production points. So some of the other limitations, um, Germany can make transfers to any of its allies, but it cannot take or receive any from anywhere else. Um, Western allies, they can transfer to any of the Eastern allies or a Western ally nation that has a base less than itself. So, for example, Great Britain has a base of 7. They can transfer to France, who has a base of 4. So that's some of the limitations there. United States cannot make any transfers until one of its armies has actually um, moved onto the map from the U.S. box into the war. So after that, they can transfer, um, and then they can make transfers to any triple entente nation. So United States, very big. They start with a base of 9, And then during 1918, they're up to a base of 13. So the United States has a lot of production capacity if they can come in, so they can keep the Western Allies afloat with a lot of transfer of production. Russia can transfer to any of the Eastern Allies, but not any of the Western Allies. Not a lot that Russia would transfer to. Romania basically is who they would be looking to keep up, or maybe Serbia. Um, but again, they would have to, they could transfer through Romania when they're neutral for an additional one, if they would like, but they don't have a large production. They only start with four. Um, Petrograd could be increased so they could get up to five, but pretty rare that they're probably going to want to transfer very much. And so that's going through the transfer of production, and that really kind of wraps up the production phase. The next thing that happens after the production phase, I want to talk through, or the production cycle, production spending, is to go through the tech tree. This happens during production as well. And technology advancements only happen for Germany or for the Triple Entente. And essentially, what they do is they grab their deck of technology cards. And so, what they're going to do is they're going to take that deck and they're just going to flip that card and see what it is. So, in this case, Germany said they were doing this. They flipped the A2. So that's planned barrages. It can get an additional heavy artillery unit in any land supplied areas. It rolls 3 dice um, when attacking. Uh, if if attacking with an air superiority, ready or flown. It's also and then it flips to the fired side. So that basically tells you what it does. At the bottom, though, it says if your opponent has A2, you may take A1. So typically what happens if I flip A2 and I do not already possess the A1, I cannot take this card. But this says if your opponent already has A2 and you flip this card, then you can basically go through the deck and you can find the A1 card and take that instead, which then allows to place 2 heavy artillery units. And Austria-Hungary plays 1 heavy artillery unit in any land supplied area with a land army. And then again, that gets the artillery on the map that we talk about in the production or in the combat phase. So that's really how technology works. It's very simple. You take the deck, you draw from it, and then you see if you get the card. So again, you have to progress. I can't take an A2 unless I have an A1. I can't take an A3 unless I have an A2. However, some of the cards will allow you, if your opponent already has it, to kind of catch up with them so you're not getting too far behind. There are also several events in the event deck that will just say go and take A2 out of the deck, and it will just give you that ability. So that's really how the technology piece works, um, and that really rolls through the production phase. Again, some checking on the situation of the blockades, checking on the U-boats for the Western Allies and for Germany, and then going into production spending. And so that both that U-boat and blockade really only apply to Western Allies and Germany. For the Eastern Allies and for the Central Allies, they really just go straight into the production step. Neither of those sides either have the technology, so there's no technology phase for either the Central Allies or the Eastern Allies for the Triple Entente. So those minor nations, a lot quicker to roll through on their turns. They don't have any of the naval stuff. They don't have any of the U-boat stuff. They don't have any of the technology stuff that they have to work through. And so that rolls up production. The only last thing that we have to talk about is air superiority, and then just talking through events real quick. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is aerial combat and air superiority and how that works. It's one of the last phases of the production phase, or actually it's part of the regroup phase right before you move on to the next. Um, And really it only, again, applies to Western allies and Germany because it really involves their technology. What happens is, say it's a German turn, they have the P1 technology that they already have in their possession, and say that the Triple Entente also has P1. What will happen is each side rolls one die um, for their P value, right? So if they have P1 each, they're each going to roll one die. And again, we're going to have the red be the CP and the brown die be the Triple Entente. What would happen is, in this case, they're going to roll, and the German player rolled a 4. The Triple Entente rolled a 2. That is a difference of 2 because there is only one aerial superiority marker, because they each only have a P um, of P1. The German wins with a difference of 2. They only have one marker, so they can place that anywhere with one of their land supplied armies. And so they could say they're going to put air superiority in Prussia. Again, what that allows, air superiority mainly is able to be used then in subsequent attacks if they're flown to give a tie on a land battle to the defender versus a tie to the attacker. So that's how that works. Say the phasing player rolled 1, right? Um, the none would be able to be used, right? So since it's the German player's turn, essentially they did not gain air superiority, so nowhere on the map are they able to then put their air superiority marker, because their air force essentially was defeated, and so they weren't able to place it. So how it would work if it was a little bit different, so say instead of a P1 to a P1, it was a P2 to a P1. Triple Entente is still going to roll their 1 die, and now Germans are going to roll 2 dice. And like before, they're going to take the higher of the dice. So they're going to take the 5 over the 2. That's a difference of 3. Because they're at a P2, that means they have 2 markers. They could then place those markers in any areas that they wish, right? So now, again, any eligible areas anywhere with a German army that's land supplied. So that's how that works. The number of levels, the number of dice rolled. There are events that modify it. The Red Baron is an event that can be got for the German player, and that gives an additional die during the dogfight sequence, which determines how many of the markers get put out. So again, aerial combat, much like the combat for the naval, is very abstract, but gives a nice little bonus and a little flavor into the fight. Again, aerial combat is limited to Germans and Western allies. Eastern allies and the Central allies don't really have anything to do with the aerial piece. So really, just the main powers are going to be duking it out over the skies. But again, no World War I game would be complete without at least some mention of the aerial side. And so again, I think this game gives you that flavor, but in a really simple way. The very last step is to just reset any heavy artillery. So if you have any heavy artillery on the map, they just all flip back to ready status at the end of your turn. And then it would go on to whoever the next turn is. So if Germany got done, and then turn would go to the Western Allies.